Political and military interactions. Conflict and conquest. Initial motivation. The Crusades began as an effort by European Christians to reclaim Jerusalem and the Holy Land from Muslim control, prompted by the Seljuk Turks' expansion and Pope Urban II's call at the Council of Clermont in 1095. Establishment of Crusader states. The First Crusade, 1096 to 1099, led to the creation of Crusader states, such as the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, and the Principality of Antioch. These states served as outposts for European influence but were in constant conflict with surrounding Muslim powers. Muslim response. Initially fragmented, Muslim forces united under leaders like Zengi, Nur ad-Din, and Saladin, Salah al-Din. Saladin's victory at the Battle of Hattin, 1187, and the recapture of Jerusalem marked a turning point in the Crusades. Shifting power dynamics. The Crusades exacerbated tensions between competing Muslim empires, such as the Seljuk Turks and the Fatimid Caliphate. The Fourth Crusade, 1202 to 1204, diverted from its original goal and sacked Constantinople, weakening Byzantine power and indirectly aiding the rise of the Ottoman Empire. Diplomatic relations. Despite the warfare, moments of diplomacy and coexistence occurred. Truces and treaties. Agreements like the Treaty of Ramla 1192 allowed Christians to access holy sites under Muslim control. Cultural admiration. Figures like Frederick II of the Holy Roman Empire engaged in peaceful negotiations with Muslim leaders during the Sixth Crusade, showcasing mutual respect and intellectual exchange. Religious interactions. Clash of faiths. Christian and Muslim rivalry. The Crusades were framed as holy wars, with both Christians and Muslims viewing the conflict as divinely sanctioned. Each side developed theological justifications for the campaigns, reinforcing a sense of religious otherness. Religious polarization. The Crusades deepened animosity between Christianity and Islam, fueling stereotypes and mutual distrust. Muslim chroniclers like Ibn al-Athir documented the invasions as destructive and sacrilegious, while European accounts romanticized the Crusaders' mission. Internal religious divisions. Christian schism. The sacking of Constantinople by Crusaders in 1204 worsened relations between the Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches. Persecution of minorities. Jewish and Christian minorities in both Europe and the Middle East faced increased persecution, often being scapegoated during the Crusades. Economic and commercial exchanges. Expansion of trade. Mediterranean trade networks. The Crusades stimulated commerce between Europe and the Middle East. Ports like Venice, Genoa, and Pisa flourished by supplying Crusaders and facilitating trade. European demand for Middle Eastern goods such as spices, silk, and glassware surged. Resource flow. Europe exported raw materials like wool and timber, while importing luxury items, agricultural techniques, and exotic products. The establishment of trade routes through the Crusader states provided enduring connections between the two regions. Economic transformation in Europe. The influx of goods and wealth contributed to the rise of merchant classes and the growth of medieval European towns and cities. Innovations in banking and credit systems were influenced by exposure to Muslim financial practices. Cultural and intellectual interactions. Transmission of knowledge. The Crusades played a crucial role in the transfer of ideas between Europe and the Islamic world. Scientific and philosophical texts. European scholars encountered works of classical Greek philosophers, preserved and expanded upon by Muslim thinkers such as Avicenna, Ibn Sina, and Averroes, Ibn Rushd. Knowledge in medicine, astronomy, mathematics, including algebra, and engineering flowed into Europe through the Crusader states and trade. Architectural influence. Exposure to Islamic architecture inspired the development of Gothic styles in Europe, such as pointed arches and domes. Cultural practices. Europeans adopted Middle Eastern practices, including improved agricultural techniques, cuisine, e.g., spices, and hygiene. Art and literature. The Crusades inspired artistic depictions and literary works, romanticizing the conflict and idealizing chivalric encounters with the exotic East. Islamic art and decorative motifs influenced European craftsmanship, visible in textiles, ceramics, and metalwork. Long-term consequences. For Europe, integration of Eastern knowledge. The Crusades accelerated the intellectual revitalization of Europe, contributing to the Renaissance. Strengthened trade networks. Mediterranean trade set the stage for the later age of exploration. Nationalism and state building. The Crusades fostered emerging national identities and centralized monarchies. For the Middle East, strengthened Islamic unity. The Crusades, while initially disruptive, ultimately encouraged unity among Muslim powers. Cultural exchange. The interaction with Crusaders allowed some Middle Eastern societies to adopt European techniques and ideas. Military innovations. Both sides benefited from exposure to each other's military technologies and strategies. Mutual perceptions. Europe's view of Islam. The Crusades solidified Islam as a perceived cultural and religious adversary, an attitude that persisted for centuries. Islam's view of Europe. Muslim chroniclers often viewed Crusaders as barbaric and destructive, although there was admiration for certain Western advancements. Conclusion. The Crusades were a turning point in the history of interaction between Europe and the Middle East. While rooted in conflict, these campaigns created enduring connections that reshaped both regions. Politically and militarily, they marked an era of confrontation. Culturally and economically, they spurred exchanges that contributed to the development of both civilizations. Despite the legacy of animosity. 1. Political and territorial changes. Centralization of power. Monarchs gained power as many nobles perished or depleted their resources in the Crusades. This shift facilitated the rise of centralized states, especially in France and England. The weakening of smaller feudal lords and the redistribution of their lands allowed kings to consolidate authority. Geopolitical boundaries. The Crusades influenced territorial control, such as the establishment of the Crusader states in the Levant and the temporary expansion of Christian territories in Spain during the Reconquista. The decline of the Byzantine Empire after the Fourth Crusade created a power vacuum, eventually filled by the Ottoman Empire, which posed a major challenge to European kingdoms for centuries. Diplomacy and alliances. The necessity of coordination during the Crusades encouraged alliances between European states, influencing later diplomatic practices. Encounters with the Mongols and other non-Christian powers during the Crusades shaped early attempts at global diplomacy. 2. Religious and cultural impacts. Rise of religious orders. Military orders such as the Knights Templar, Hospitallers, and Teutonic Knights played key roles during the Crusades and later became influential in European politics, finance, and warfare. Christianization efforts. The crusading spirit was redirected towards internal and external non-Christian populations, including the Baltic Crusades, aimed at converting pagan groups in Northern Europe. Religious intolerance deepened, manifesting in expulsions and persecution of Jews and Muslims in Europe, such as during the Spanish Reconquista and the Inquisition. Cultural exchange and integration. Despite the conflict, the Crusades facilitated the transfer of knowledge, architecture, and culture between East and West. Exposure to Islamic advancements in medicine, astronomy, and philosophy influenced European intellectual growth, eventually feeding into the Renaissance. 3. Economic growth and transformation. Trade networks. The Crusades opened and intensified trade routes linking Europe with the Middle East and Asia. Cities like Venice and Genoa flourished as hubs for Eastern goods such as spices, textiles, and precious metals. The demand for luxury goods imported from the East spurred economic activity and contributed to the development of a merchant class in Europe. Financial innovations. The need to fund large-scale crusading campaigns led to the development of banking systems and credit mechanisms. Institutions like the Knights Templar operated as early international banking networks. Monarchs increasingly taxed their subjects, laying the groundwork for modern state finance. Urbanization. The economic boom fueled by expanded trade led to the growth of cities and towns, which became centers of commerce and culture. 4. Intellectual and technological advancements. Transmission of knowledge. The Crusades exposed Europeans to Islamic scholarship, preserving and expanding upon ancient Greek and Roman texts that had been lost in the West. Advancements in navigation, mathematics, and engineering were integrated into European practices. Military innovations. Europeans adopted technologies such as the crossbow, improved siege engines, and fortification designs like concentric castles from their encounters in the Middle East. Educational growth. Universities in Europe began to incorporate knowledge from the Islamic world, laying the intellectual foundations for the scholastic movement and, eventually, the Renaissance. 5. Shifts in European identity. Unified Christian identity. The Crusades fostered a stronger sense of pan-European identity under the banner of Christendom, despite internal divisions like the Great Schism, 1054. The Crusades' failure and the fall of the Crusader states in 1291 led to introspection about Europe's role in the world and contributed to the decline of papal authority. Emergence of nationalism. As monarchs gained power, distinct national identities began to emerge. For example, the Reconquista in Spain reinforced a sense of Spanish identity tied to Catholicism. Exploration and expansion. The crusading spirit lived on in European expansion beyond the Mediterranean. The Age of Discovery in the 15th and 16th centuries can be seen as an extension of the same desire for conquest and religious propagation. Conclusion. The Crusades and the expansion of European kingdoms were defining elements of the medieval period, leaving a legacy that shaped Europe's future. Politically, they enabled the rise of strong centralized states. Economically, they opened Europe to global trade and innovations. Culturally, the exchange of ideas contributed to the Renaissance, while religiously, the conflicts defined relationships between Christianity, Islam, and Judaism for centuries. These developments set the stage for Europe's global influence during the early modern era. Banda NOI. The Crusades and the interaction between Europe and the Middle East. ChatGPT NOI. The Crusades significantly influenced the interaction between Europe and the Middle East, shaping political, religious, cultural, and economic dynamics between the two regions. These campaigns, spanning roughly from the late